She was Associate Vice President for Development at Rice, a role in which she was responsible for the day-to-day operations of individual fundraising programs and also oversaw various departments within the development and alumni relations component, including gift planning, major gifts, school-based fundraising, and annual giving. Prior to that, Kathi was at Duke University's Duke Cancer Institute, and prior to that, Cornell University College of Engineering. She earned her MA in cell and sorry, my tongue's tied, it's Friday. Kathi earned her MA in cell and molecular biology and microbiology from Duke University. She also achieved her BA in biology at Hampton University. She's originally from Alexandria, Virginia, and she and her husband and her son and her babies, Pearl and Tyson, have all joined making their home here in Texas now. Welcome, and welcome to a little bit of relief in our heat. So I will turn it over to you, Kathi. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Beth. Can you hear me okay? Yes, okay. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Let me... there we go. Are you all seeing the screen now? Yes. Can you give me a head nod, Beth, if you're seeing just the screen, the presentation? Thank you so much. And as you noted, it's storming here, so I can hear it rolling into Sugarland. So if somehow I get disconnected, I'll certainly log back in on my phone and do the best that I can to work through the presentation. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. And thank you so much to all of you who are joining us for this participation or for this discussion today. As Beth noted, we originally started planning this several months ago, and I agreed to do the presentation more than 6 months ago. At the time, I had just given a presentation on the same topic at the CASE Conference on Leadership and Development in January out in Seattle. When I agreed to do this presentation, I certainly anticipated that I would have to make some, what I thought at the time might be relatively minor modifications because the CASE Conference is an audience of folks in the higher education or realm primarily. And so I thought I'd make tweaks more about the audience that would be participating through the AFP platform, which is a lot more diverse, a lot more different kinds of organizations that end up being represented. And then, of course, about 7 weeks ago, the nation and eventually much of the world really found itself embroiled in the aftermath of what happened following the death of George Floyd, protests about racial and social injustice. And those, again, caused me to think a little bit differently about what I might say today, because those incidents also impacted me as a person and as a professional in some really unexpected ways. Of course, they stimulated new discussions with students and alumni about issues of racial injustice and systemic oppression at Rice. They also sparked new conversations about these topics, diversity, equity, and inclusion within members of my own advancement team. But they also caused me to rethink my own visibility and my sense of place as an African-American woman in our profession, especially since I'm the only African-American woman who leads one of the top CASE 75 advancement programs. Trying to advance my slides here. So while today we will, as I had originally intended, we will look at the shifting donor populations and discuss strategies to provide diverse, equitable, and inclusive practices within our organizations. I'll also now be talking to you about how these incidences have impacted me and my organization a bit, and talk about what we're doing within the Development and Alumni Relations Division at Rice to address these issues in light of recent occurrences. So first, I wanted to start with the definition of diversity, equity, inclusion so that we are all on the same page. And I apologize, I've tried several times to turn off some of my notifications and they're not turning off. Apologies. So again, let me start with a definition of diversity, equity, inclusion and why these concepts are important. They're important first and foremost because they're core values, or at least they should be for any organization worth its salt. When they're promoted together and actually live together, along with the concept of access, which I know AFP membership is talking a lot about, and which they define as the act of fostering attitudes, behaviors, and procedures to promote equity and diversity and creating inclusion, then these allow individuals to maximize their contribution to our organizations and within our communities. So ultimately, diversity, equity, inclusion, and access create the sense of belonging that allows the full potential of individuals and organizations to be realized. So now that we've defined diversity and equity and inclusion and talked a bit about access, why they're all important, at least for our purposes today, and we could go into a much deeper discussion about them all. I want to dive into how the demographics of the US population and therefore our primary donor populations are shifting. So we represent a myriad of different organizations. I was pleasantly surprised to see the broad array of organizations represented on the attendee list, and I took a look just yesterday, and I know it's gotten even a little bit bigger. We all represent organizations whose donor constituencies are becoming increasingly racially and ethnically diverse. US demographics are continuing to shift, and it's projected that by the year 2050, we will be a minority country. Now, of course, I lead fundraising at an institution of higher education, and I have been at institutions of higher education nearly my entire career. So that's my most powerful set of experiences. And institutions of higher education in particular are becoming drastically more diverse every year. So let's put that in perspective. So Rice celebrated its 100-year anniversary back in 2012, 2013. In 2016, Rice celebrated 50 years of Black life at Rice. So Black students are now approximately 10% of Rice's entering freshman class. For half of its existence, Rice did not admit a constituency that now makes up 10% of its student population. And just to flesh out the demographics a bit, in the most recent entering class, which was 2019, the population was 18% Hispanic, 30% Asian, and 6% other. So only 30% of the entering freshman class was white. Now, as I said earlier, I know that most of you participating today are not institutions of higher education, but again, these demographics are shifting and they're impacting all of us and how all of our organizations operate and how we engage with each other as professionals. If you add to this that since the year 1990, the number of registered charities has nearly doubled, we all find ourselves competing for mind share and support amongst a rapidly diversifying audience and in an increasingly crowded landscape. According to a report by the Education Advisory Board in 2018, the source of philanthropic support in 2016 resembled the population of the US circa 1990. Now, another article cites a report by Blackbaud that notes that nearly 75% of donors today are non-Hispanic whites, despite the fact that they make up only 64% of the population. That same report goes on to note that African American and Hispanic donors said they were solicited less frequently, but also they indicated that they would give more if they had indeed been asked more often. So this underrepresentation of multicultural donors suggests that organized philanthropy is not doing an adequate job of engaging non-white communities. So why are we seeing fewer Americans give? Because in addition to not seeking them out or asking them for money as frequently as we could, we're often applying the same approaches that we've used since the 1960s to engage donors, particularly in institutions of higher education. So let's peel the layers back a little bit more and take a brief look at the wealth and the behaviors of just some of these diverse populations. So this slide highlights some data from a report from EAB again, which is called The Changing Face of the 21st Century Donor, as well as a couple of other reports. And just to put a finer point on it, there are several things that are really striking. $10 million plus women-owned firms increased by 59% in the year 2013. So that's from 7 years ago, obviously. Over the past decade, African-American families have contributed the largest portion of their wealth to charity than any other racial group. Women, again, control 48% of estates that are worth more than $5 million. And by some estimates, as much as 2/3 of all wealth in the US will be controlled by women by the year 2030. So obviously that is less than 10 years away. And another data point that's interesting is that 63% of Hispanic households give to charity, which compares with just a little over half of all US households in general. So information about the LGBTQ community is a little bit more difficult to come by. It's not self-reported as often, but it is increasingly becoming available. And the same report, The Changing Face of the 21st Century Donor, gives us some additionally important statistics. Approximately 4 to 7% of the US population is LGBTQ. And at institutions of higher education, we know that the percentage amongst the student body is even higher than this average. So that is on the increase. Due to a recent Supreme Court decision, same-sex couples no longer have to pay estate taxes on inheritance from their late spouses. So the estimate is that there will be as much as $500 billion, not a half billion, $500 billion in estate tax exempt inheritances that would be accessible potentially for charities. And both the volunteerism and average philanthropy of this group is significantly higher than the US average. So I just wanted to touch a bit on a few statistics. You could go on, and there's a lot of great resources out there. That's why I'm citing these things and encourage you to continue to do your own reading, which I'm sure you're doing. But there's a lot of opportunity and in amongst these diverse populations. And one more set of statistics that I wanted to share. So this slide lists the top 3 areas of giving for African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans. As you see, places of worship, children's and health charities, which tie, and social services organizations all show up in their top 3. For some of them, higher education doesn't even show up until number 8 or lower. I think it gets as high as 5 for Asian Americans. The number in blue is something I also list here and I wanted to point out to you. This is the total buying power for each of these demographics. And this data is from 2016. So as you can see, African Americans had $1.1 trillion in buying power, Hispanics $1.5 trillion in buying power, and Asian Americans $1 trillion in buying power. And as we've been discussing, the size of these populations and their buying power, all things being equal in the marketplace, is only increasing. So now we've talked about what diversity, equity, and inclusion are and why they're important. We've also talked about how the demographics of our donors are shifting and what potentially, potential opportunities might exist if we were to look at those populations and really have a fully holistic approach in terms of how we engage them and seek their support. Let's shift a bit to talk about what's happening in the advancement profession. So I'm sharing with you some data that's from a 2018 case survey amongst its members, the Council for the Advancement and Support of Education. So it's looking at diversity and advancement and contrasting it with the US population. So you can see for yourself the numbers in blue. I hope it's not hard for you to read. The US population, while the numbers in yellow show you what diversity and advancement actually looks like. And you can see how completely out of whack these numbers are. But what's even more stark about this report is that fully 21% of the institutions that responded said that they had no racially diverse talent in their advancement offices. Why does our profession remain so undiverse? And I have to give credit to a friend of mine. I think he created this graphic when he was at University of Michigan. He's now out at Oregon Health Sciences University. And he talks about the invirtuous cycle that perpetuates lack of diversity in our profession. And we often talk about the fundraising cycle, of course, so he thought about what the cycle is that contributes to this lack of diversity. He talks about the fact that we know 88 to 89% of our profession is not diverse. Add to that diversity, equity, inclusion, that these topics are really tough to address and haven't been in the recent past, certainly ones that folks address or really address head on and in a constructive and productive way. And you talk about how volunteers and donors tend to refer others like themselves. And when we do train volunteers, alumni, donors who out there, or even members of our staff, we don't always educate them about DEI issues effectively. And then from our perspective in higher education, we talk about how there's often inadequate or incomplete alumni data on diverse populations. And the cycle just continues to perpetuate itself. And then the box in the middle is just something I added, which is that there's bias that's embedded in our advancement strategies, even strategies for donor outreach, strategies in our research, and our metrics and things like that, and in our hiring and other approaches. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So we have to be conscious of this, and we have to be deliberate about the approaches that we take in order to break this cycle and improve diversity within our profession, as well as equity and inclusion. So with that, I'll shift to talking about what leaders can do to address challenges in recruiting and training and retaining a diverse workforce, first and foremost. So at the risk of giving you a lot of information on slides, I did want to share a lot of different tactics and approaches just as food for thought for everyone. And hopefully if these can serve as a resource to you beyond our conversation, I'm happy for you to have this information. But first and foremost, diversity conscious and inclusive leaders, they have authentic conversations and collaborations with people that entail listening and feeling. And I'll touch a bit on what we're doing at Rice in a few minutes. These are hard conversations, as we all know, and they do require you to be vulnerable and emotionally available, but they're critical for us to addressing these challenges and to making productive and positive changes. Also, just understanding that they sometimes unknowingly commit racial microaggressions and inadvertently make mistakes. And that's just part of us evolving as individuals, as human beings, as we continue our understanding and seek growth. But the important thing is that people boldly confront the longstanding problems in their departments and their institutions. And I say boldly because it will take a bold and determined but respectful set of efforts in order to make change, because there are systemic things that have been occurring, and the problems have been occurring for a long time. And so they have to be addressed very deliberately. Developing, promoting professional literacy, what we're reading, what we're learning, how we're engaging with our peers on this topic. I know that since the events that happened several weeks ago within our team, we've been sharing a lot more resources with each other. There's actually a lot of knowledge base about this within our own team, both folks who've been in the advancement profession for a long time and others from other professions who studied these issues in their academic experiences. But there's a wealth of information out there. So it's much, much easier to develop this literacy if you seek it out. For leaders, of course, you have to institute multi-level accountability because the problem's not going to change if there's not accountability at the highest level and down in order for things to actually be addressed. Individuals have to undertake self-reflection, promote honesty, professional honesty, and seek to remediate their own shortcomings. And when you walk into meetings, you have to notice who's actually seated at the table and who is not. And I think it's much easier if you are a member of a diverse group to do that, because often you're the only. But when you're not, and if you want to be an ally, that's also a really critical thing that you have to do in order to help to promote change. And then refusing to be convinced that there's actually a shortage of qualified candidates out there for positions, as well as for key leadership roles. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So how do we promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, in particular in our talent management efforts? So first, becoming aware of the problems first setting real goals for what it is you want to achieve as an organization. When I did this presentation in January, I was again talking to an audience of folks from CASE, and I acknowledged that CASE had set a goal for diversity amongst the profession of about 18% ethnic diversity. I think at the time it was at about 9 or 10%. And that goal they wanted to reach by 2021. So each organization has a goal. What is meaningful for them? What's reflective of the constituencies you serve, the populations that you serve? Because we all know if we don't set goals, we are doomed not to move forward. Focus on talent. And by this, I mean, don't focus on credentials and backgrounds. Focus on exceptional intelligence, on creativity, on flexibility. Look for qualities that show you that the person has the tenacity to be successful in this profession. Fearlessness, authenticity, courage. There are trainings for development, but you can't necessarily train for these other qualities, right? There's trainings to be an advancement professional, but you can't train for these qualities. So be open-minded and what some have called shrewdly optimistic about what opportunities can exist and how people could add value to your organization. Don't place arbitrary limits on the potential of your employees. I say this because diverse groups are sometimes kept at bay. Too often, folks are groomed to be great support. One of the most pivotal moments in my career came when I told a former supervisor of mine that I was looking at other opportunities. It was a really amicable conversation. We had a good relationship. And in the end, it was at the end of a campaign. We were both about to embark upon a quest for our next opportunity. And the person said something that I've never forgotten. They said, "Oh, that's great. You know, you would make a great number 2. At the time, I was already that person's number 2 in an organization. But I remember feeling dumbstruck because in their mind, that's all that I was supposed to be. I was not supposed to be number 1. I certainly wasn't supposed to take their position if they were to leave. But it was very clear to me that they had placed limits on me, and those were certainly accruing to how I saw myself. And at that moment, I knew it was time for me to leave the organization. You know, use opportunities as a development tool for your employees. I remember when I first started as a fundraiser and had an opportunity to work with, I happened to be a philanthropist of color who was trying to make a significant major gift to the organization. And quite frankly, they were very candid about how they were pleased and inspired that I was the gift officer, and it wasn't because I had been deliberately assigned. It just so happened that I was engaging with them because that wasn't common for them. And then the supervisor that I had at the time moved that relationship from that person to them without sort of any conversation about the potential ramifications. And unbeknownst to them, the donor came back to me and said, "I don't understand why I can't work with you. That was exciting for me." And they, went on to have the conversation. But the fact that that opportunity had been moved both impacted the donor, but it also impacted me as a professional and sort of limited my perspective and my confidence, frankly, about what it was I thought I could do. So the next point kind of ties to that, which is giving your employees opportunities to fail. So believe it or not, sometimes well-meaning bosses fail to give folks the chance to fail. But as I once heard another leader outside of the advancement profession to say, when they were talking about quality of leadership, they said their job is to give them opportunities, give their employees opportunities to both soar and to fail, and to make sure that they failed in the boundaries of what they as a leader had the potential to provide them cover for. I think that that's really critical. The leaders who have been most effective for me in my career and working with me and supporting me, and who I've been most drawn to, are also those who have acknowledged their shortcomings and the limitations in this arena, who've embraced uncomfortable truths about their organization, and those who've invited me to be part of the process of improvement. So I think that's another critical point. Of course, staff training to better understand diverse constituencies and how to work with them is really critical. And I think increasingly that's something that is more common, but it still has to be something that's deliberately undertaken in order to help staff be successful in this regard. And the last point I wanted to point out is to not underestimate the expectations that do get placed on diverse members of your staff, especially those who are in leadership positions, because there are often too few of us. These can be quite large and quite taxing, but often we are also highly visible, and so people do, ask us to participate in things, and it can be both invigorating and a wonderful opportunity, but also a burden that is a little bit more difficult to carry. So just don't underestimate the expectations that are often placed on leaders in diverse roles. So moving on to talk about promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in donor engagement. Making sure you can see my slide here. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties. There's some of the same traits that you have to undertake, but then certainly a lot of different tactics that are really important. First of all, become aware of the problems. Become aware of the challenges that are inherent in how your system is organized and your structures and your metrics, things like that. Identify the systems and the structures that actually perpetuate problems in how you engage donors. What do I mean by that? The work that you do to designate donors or designate prospects as having the potential to give, your research and donor identification methods, how you constitute donor pools. And thank you to everybody who's being extremely patient as we deal with this. And obviously, Mother Nature does not care about the fact that we are all relegated to Zoom nowadays. So I believe I just started the conversation, the part of the presentation about promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in donor engagement. Talking about, it's very important to just become aware of the problems, the systems and the structures that perpetuate those problems. And that we have to recognize that there are differences in experiences for the diverse constituents who engage with our organizations. It's really important for us to listen to these experiences, even if the conversations are tough, of course, but also don't assume that these are deal breakers for the engagement of these folks with the organizations. Recognize and honor when it comes to alumni in particular, but in general, just honor the diversity and complexity and giving interests for our donors, and consider that these alumni are often already connected, but help them make connections where you can as well. And consider tactics like giving circles or just peer-to-peer engagement to foster networking amongst them and to maximize the impact of their potential philanthropy. And lastly, don't assume that diversity initiatives are their primary targets, of course. I think everybody probably thinks that we wouldn't do that, but that can be what happens. And I said lastly, but I actually wanted to add one more thing, which is be cognizant of who is making the outreach and making the ask. And I gave you a story from my own experience many, many years ago, and it does really make a difference when you are engaging with these diverse populations. So I told you when I started the conversation that I wanted to talk with you about how recent events had impacted Rice's operations of late. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of a picture of a case study for what we experienced with our Giving Day, the 24-hour challenge that Rice has done basically for each of the past few years, I believe since fiscal year 15 might have been, or 14 might have been the first time that we've done a Giving Day. Originally, our 24-hour challenge day, our Giving Day, was set for April 4th. And of course, after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we all went to remote working mid-March. We knew we were going to have to postpone that day. So we originally postponed it to June 5th. And then, of course, after Memorial Day, there were the incidences related to George Floyd's murder. And we were already thinking about whether or not the 5th was going to still work. And if so, what strategies did we need to undertake? A lot of conversations, I'm sure you all were having conversations as that impacted some of the strategies that you were undertaking. And we had a group of student leaders here at Rice, the leaders of the various colleges, which is what we call our dorms, for those of you who don't know, and our student associations, who reached out to us in light particularly of the aftermath from George Floyd's murder and asked us to cancel or postpone our giving day. So what ended up happening is we ultimately did set a third date of June 25th, which was just 5 days before the end of our fiscal year on June 30th, because it really was critical that we sought and secured those unrestricted funds for our students. Normally our challenge does focus on the Rice Annual Fund, which is unrestricted for student life and learning. We had already begun contemplating a change in our strategy in the light of everything. And inviting people to give to a myriad of funds beyond just the Rice Annual Fund. But the outreach from these students really opened up a rich and helpful dialogue, which led to us adding even more giving opportunities and even creating new ones that the students had designated that related specifically to Black student life at Rice. And these students felt so supported and heard when we responded to their outreach that they also agreed to participate in the challenge by producing a video for us and doing some social media posts and other things like that. So I want to give you a happy ending to the story. The new giving option that we created, which was amongst a myriad of others, but one in particular that was created to support all of the Black student clubs at Rice. That was not a fund we had before. It ended up being the top new fund that was promoted and had the top number of donors through this challenge. And so it ended up also receiving a bonus in terms of challenge dollars because of how successful it was. But most telling, the totals raised for the Rice Annual Fund, which is usually the only thing we focused on, were still commensurate to previous challenge years. And now that the final totals are in and we've closed the books for this past fiscal year, I can tell you that the overall total that we raised on the day of giving, which was over $1.4 million, is the largest amount we've ever raised on any 24-hour challenge day at Rice. So this experience was extremely challenging. We changed our strategies, literally undertook 3 different strategies for our giving day. We learned about what is important to many of our constituents, and we created incredible goodwill with current students who will be future alumni. We now also have some data that suggests, of course, that broadening and diversifying giving opportunities creates more benefit for Rice. And there are many other funds and new funds that we created as part of this project, and not just ones to support Black student experience at Rice. And those also had, new donors and new dollars. So what we saw is that the pie got larger. The slices did not, in fact, get smaller. And now we have a story to tell and some data to show to people that the strategy and a larger, more inclusive strategy can work. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically about the recent efforts we've undertaken to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion activities and advancement specifically on my team at Rice, and then I'll get to your questions. So you can see this slide, you'll see I have 2 buckets of things we are currently doing right now and things that are on the table for the future. So currently, and we just launched this about 4 or 5 weeks ago, we've launched what we're calling the LEAD DAR, Development Alumni Relations Forward Task Force. And this task force, the goal of it is to ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are a consistent priority within DAR, that we take specific actions to improve our culture and overall employee experience. And we've also asked this group to act as leaders in this area by providing recommendations and resources and be key activators of this change to our internal culture within DAR, or enhancements to our internal culture at DAR and the team member experience. And this group also is being asked to provide guidance and support for staff who are working with external members of the Rice community when they face issues of bias and discrimination and equity. So this Lead DAR Forward task force is being led by members of our leadership team. And the reason for that is to ensure the responsibility and buy-in for these efforts. They start at the top. So there's about 19 or 20 people within our leadership team. So not just senior leaders, but mid-level managers who are members of this Lead DAR Forward task force. We've also created what's currently termed as the Champions Group. And that's a group that can be drawn from any of our staff to help inform the efforts of the task force and also implement the task force recommendations. So we have strategy and implementation that's happening throughout the organization. We've also developed resources and talking points for staff to use when engaging with our constituents on matters of bias and social justice. We're also facilitating conversations with our teams on these issues. And sometimes these are tough conversations. We have created some safe space Zoom meetings for people to listen, learn, and reflect, reading and discussion groups, etc. So those are just the current things, a few of the current things that we're doing. In the future, we're preparing to implement staff trainings on implicit bias and cultural competency and role playing for dealing with constituents. I should say that in the aftermath of what happened in May, Rice announced that they were launching a new vice provost position for diversity, equity, and inclusion. This position had not existed. It will report to our provost, and our provost is brand new as of June 1, I believe. And so what we're doing ahead of what Rice has been doing. And as soon as that person is online, and which we hope will be in the next month or so, we will absolutely tap into their office as a resource to accelerate what we're doing. We'll also be undertaking things like an internal equity assessment and audit, doing a survey of our alumni population to understand how it looks from a diversity perspective and understand more of the sentiment and considerations. We will also undertake eventually DEI training for our volunteers, and we'll be looking at the portfolios for our donors, for our prospect managers and our metrics to ensure that they reflect the values that I've been talking about throughout this presentation. So with that, I want to end this part of the presentation and just turn it over for questions and discussion if any exists. And again, I want to thank folks for staying with me for not one, but two disconnections. And I look forward to answering any questions that are out there.
Great, Kathi, we appreciate it. And thank you everyone for your patience as we did have some technical difficulties. One of the questions, Kathi, is would you be willing to share your slides?
Sure.
Okay, great. We can definitely get those out to everybody then. I know that they enjoyed the ones they got to see and will enjoy the ones that they did not get to see as well. I have a question from someone within our participation. They are a development director of color. They have often found that they've represented a few in this field. What advice can you give them to push forward for advancement?
Well, I think being your own advocate is critical, but I think also finding the helpers and the allies within your organization and outside of your organization. And I put myself amongst those ranks from the start of my career in a leadership role. I have made it a point to be accessible when anyone has asked me, because I didn't really have those resources when I was coming up. But I've made it a point to be a resource and to find those people who can be in your corner and give you guidance and give you support and give you encouragement and tell you that you can do it and how you can do it. To look for the organizations that value your contributions, places like Rice, and I'm not just saying Rice is the only place, but there are plenty of them out there. But look for organizations whose values align with yours because they exist. And if they're worth their salt, their hiring practices and their efforts promote it. And also make sure that as you're building your resume and your toolkit, that you're seeking opportunities that really demonstrate your capacity. And if there, if there are opportunities to take on things within your organization so you can grow your resume and enhance it, that's great. I think that has been critical and important for me. And also recognize that there are ways that you can sell yourself and sell your capacity that that don't always exactly align with kind of traditional ways that people look for major gift officers. Early in the presentation, I will share my slides, I talked about what it means to look for talent and what kind of traits you're looking for. So, learn how to talk about yourself and what you've accomplished also in those terms, because organizations who are more progressive in terms of how they're hiring recognize that those are the skill sets and the indicators of a potential for success in all of the talent that they're seeking. And so if you can understand how to translate what you have been doing in light of those words, you can make yourself stand out as a candidate as people are looking to hire good talent.
Great, thank you for that answer. How do we address a history of exclusion within our own organizations as we try to improve our organizations, in particular in higher education, where our constituents might have had inequitable experiences compared to peers?
And that is, I think, at the crux of what it is we're talking about here, and it's probably certainly an even longer conversation. What I didn't talk about here, I said that some of the things we plan to undertake from the DAR, the lead DAR forward task force efforts that we're planning, is that we plan to do an alumni survey. But I think you have to have the courage to create spaces for conversations with all of these constituents. So we're focusing a lot in DAR on what we can do to support our own team internally and change things within our systems and structures. But ultimately, you do have to look externally and look at how how your constituents are seeing you and what it is you're trying to do. Recognizing that there are some deep-seated things that create power imbalances and challenges in terms of diversifying our profession and our outreach, and that we have to work to systematically unravel them. And it's a long process. It requires conversations. It requires deliberate actions. It requires people to be uncomfortable. It also requires organizations to be, frankly, willing to say, we know we may lose donors, lose constituents, but these are our values. And this is how we are moving forward as an organization. So you do have to have, there are a lot of things I can do as VP and how I manage my staff, but I'm also doing things that align with Rice's values too. And so you do have to have the larger cover and the larger umbrella of what the larger institution can tolerate. And so I think that's critical. I think change can only occur if it's really occurring throughout the breadth of the organization. And so I think it's important that, you try to make that change permeate throughout the organization.
Okay, I'm going to wrap a couple of questions into one kind of more long, because they all seem to kind of tie together. Starting with, how do you specifically attract Black talent to apply? Can you expand a little bit more on hiring practices? You spoke about looking beyond their resume. And where are additional opportunities to recruit diverse talent for advancement office?
Okay, those are a few questions. Can you, since I'm not looking,
Sure.
Can you say those again?
How do you specifically attract Black talent to apply? Can you expand on your comment about looking beyond their resume? And where are opportunities to recruit diverse talent?
Okay, got it. So, and again, my lens comes from working in higher ed. So some of my responses are going to be specific to higher ed, but I'm going to go out on a limb and make the presumption that there's some commensurate resources in other organizations like CASE, which I've referenced, which supports higher education institutions. In terms of opportunities to recruit diverse candidates, you know, CASE has things like internship programs, which we have participated in at Rice. They have a Minority Advancement Institute that they've also promoted. And so participating in these, sending our members, sending our staff to them are opportunities to both, you know, recruit folks and also, you know, get more visibility that Rice is a good place for people to be. I make myself available to present and encourage many members of my team to present, to talk about who Rice is and the larger values we have as an organization. So I think all of those things accrue to improving your own visibility and being present where the talent is. There's also something called the African American Development Officers Organization, which is now partnered with CASE. And one of the things we did 2 years ago is we partnered with them to host some of their activities. I've started going and members of my team have started to go. And while the title is the African American Development Officers Network, it is meant to be a diverse and inclusive organization. And so when I was at the conference, I found it was an extremely diverse experience and one of the best conferences that I've gone to. And so through our efforts in partnering with them, we've recruited some folks who came to one of the events that they hosted. So you have to show up, you have to seek out these other partners, and you have to send not just one person or your talent management person, but other individuals in the organization. And they have to be able to tell a strong story about what your organization is, what they value, and why they think you know, that organization would be a good place for them. You also asked about, you know, expanding on looking beyond the resume. I touched on that a little bit in the answer I think I gave to the question 2 questions ago. And it comes down to, I guess, the old adage about kind of transferable skills. And, you know, I've been part of conversations and exercises where we talk about, well, what is it we're looking for with a major gift officer or whatever the position is you're looking to fill. And then just going through the thought process of, well, what does this really look like in other types of professions? How might this show up? So it's easy to think about how a sales related role, for instance, which I know what we do is not sales, but how a sales related role translates to fundraising. But you can go beyond that and you can think about other roles where there's skills and skill sets, inquisitiveness, good listening, just kind of the courageousness to engage with people and ask them to be a part of whatever it is they're doing, which ultimately translates to asking them for money. If you think differently about who you're looking for and why and where those skills might show up, that's one way to kind of, you know, look beyond a person's resume or whether they've actually done a particular job before and have the exact experience to look at whether they might be able to do the job. Because as I said before, you can go to trainings on development, and most likely you're going to send your staff to training. So it might take a little bit longer of investment in that person if you were to hire that person, but the underlying skills that you're looking for, if they come with them, you're really just giving them some on-the-job training that will allow them to be successful, particularly within your organization. And your first question was about Black talent in particular. I touched on some of the organizations like the AADO through CASE, and also you know, the internship programs and the Minority Advancement Institute. I think those are 3 good ways, but they're not just for Blacks in development, but I think, you know, they certainly help you identify that population. But, you know, the idea is to create whatever the diverse population that is going to underscore the values and the goals. As I said in my presentation, you need to set goals for what it is you want to accomplish from a diversity perspective, and and look for ways to achieve them. That's what our goals are within Rice.
Great, thank you, Kathy, and we're almost out of time. Lots of thank yous and appreciation for your insight and that. And I've asked Megan to capture all of the questions. I think I've gotten to pretty much all of them. There may be some additional ones that come on, but we're going to send you the questions. And if you have any additional insight you would like to share and answer them, and then we can send that out with your presentation as well to the registered participants. But we truly appreciate your opportunity that you've provided today. And it looks like it was well enjoyed despite our minor interruptions.